On February 28, 2026, something happened that most geopolitical analysts thought they would never see. Not like this, not this fast. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who ruled Iran with absolute authority for 36 years, was killed in a joint US-Israeli airstrike on his compound in Tehran. Iranian state media confirmed his death on March 1st and declared 40 days of national mourning. The Islamic Republic had just lost the only leader most Iranians under 50 had ever known. And as of March 2nd, the situation is still moving. Active strikes, retaliatory missiles, closed airspace, and a question no one has a clean answer to yet. What happens to Iran now? What does the death of one man mean for 90 million people, for the entire region, and for global energy markets already under pressure? That is what this video is going to break down, carefully, based on verified reporting, and without the noise that is filling most coverage right now. Let's start with what actually happened on February 28th, because the details of how this was executed matter for understanding everything that followed. The strikes began at approximately 9:45 in the morning Tehran time, a Saturday, a regular workday in Iran. That timing was deliberate, not coincidental. According to the New York Times and multiple Israeli officials, the CIA had spent months tracking Khamenei's movements. Intelligence indicated a senior leadership meeting would bring him above ground at a known location. The operation, codenamed Roaring Lion by Israel and Epic Fury by the US Pentagon, hit targets in Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, and Kermanshah simultaneously in a coordinated opening wave. Israeli jets dropped 30 bombs on Khamenei's compound in a daytime strike. The New York Times described it as a massive, wildly bold daytime attack, aimed at senior leaders from the very first minutes of the operation. It wasn't only Khamenei. IDF spokesperson Effie Defrin confirmed that IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour, Defense Minister Amir Nasserzadeh, and National Security Council Secretary Ali Shamkhani were also killed. Israeli officials said the operation eliminated between 5 and 10 top Iranian leaders who had gathered at that same location. Analysts across multiple outlets described it as a catastrophic intelligence failure by Tehran, a fatal miscalculation of operational security. Now here is what sets the context for everything that followed. This confrontation had been building for weeks, and the trajectory was visible to anyone paying attention to the actual signals. In January 2026, the largest anti-regime protest since Iran's 1979 revolution erupted across more than 100 cities, driven by economic collapse and the fall of the rial against all major currencies. The Iranian regime's response was a brutal crackdown. Thousands of protesters were killed, with Khamenei personally ordering the violence, according to multiple intelligence assessments cited by Western governments. That crackdown shifted the calculus in Washington in a way that public statements didn't fully capture. Trump began moving from pressure as leverage towards something more operational in its character. 2 U.S. carrier strike groups were repositioned to the region, and B-2 stealth bombers were sent to Diego Garcia, head of the strikes. F-22s and F-35s were moved forward to the Middle East, at a scale analysts described as the largest U.S. military buildup in that region since 2003. At the same time, Trump sent Iran a private letter through Oman proposing nuclear talks, under a specific deadline window, according to Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. Iran's public response was open defiance. Khamenei appeared on camera on February 17th and warned that U.S. warships in the region could be sunk if confrontation came. Nuclear talks in Geneva broke down in early February. Diplomatic channels closed. And then on February 28th, the strikes came, in daylight, at the moment when Iran's top leadership was gathered in one place. In my view, the critical question here is not whether the United States had the capability to do this. That answer has always been yes, and everyone in Tehran knew it. The more important question is what the decision to actually execute this operation signals about where U.S. policy is heading, and what the system Khamenei built does now that he is gone. Because the morning after the strikes, Iran did not freeze. It retaliated with a scale and reach that went significantly beyond anything it had done in previous confrontations with the United States. The IRGC declared what it called the most devastating offensive operation in the history of the Islamic Republic, and began launching missiles and drones at U.S. military bases across the entire Gulf region. Iran struck 4 major U.S. installations simultaneously: Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Ali Al Salem in Kuwait, Al Dhafra in the UAE, and the U.S. Navy 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Civilian infrastructure was also hit. Airports in Kuwait and the UAE were struck. Jebel Ali port in Dubai, one of the world's busiest logistics hubs, was hit by drone debris. Explosions were reported in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha in rapid succession. The IRGC also announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz to all shipping. UK maritime trade operations confirmed that vessels in the Gulf were receiving radio messages stating no ships were permitted to transit. And this is where the story becomes economic as well as military, because the Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of all global petroleum. Closing it even partially, even for days, does not just affect Iran or the United States. The consequences move through every connected economy on the planet. It affects energy prices in Tokyo, electricity bills in Berlin, and fuel costs across America. The global economy runs on that corridor. As of March 2nd, that corridor is not a geopolitical abstraction. It is in an active military confrontation with no clear end date visible. In my view, the most important thing to understand about February 28th is this. The United States didn't just strike a military installation. It struck the center of a political system operating continuously since 1979. Khamenei was not just a title. He was the connective tissue of the entire Iranian state, appointing judges, commanding the IRGC, and directing foreign policy. He also personally managed every succession structure in the system, meaning the plan for what happens after him was held almost entirely in his own hands. His death has created a succession crisis inside an active military conflict, with a partially decapitated command structure and an IRGC that is still operational. Across Iran, the population is divided between those who took to the streets to celebrate and those gathering to mourn, a divide that tells its own story about the regime's legitimacy. Iran's constitution calls for an interim leadership council, comprising President Pezeshkian, the judiciary head, and a guardian council jurist. But Pezeshkian's own whereabouts were reported as unknown as of March 1st, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already unstable command picture. The Council on Foreign Relations made the point directly in its analysis. Taking out Khamenei is not the same as regime change because the IRGC is the regime, and the IRGC is still intact and still fighting. What this means on March 2nd is that this situation is not resolved. It is at an inflection point. The head of the system has been removed, but the body is still moving. And the direction it moves next is the question. Drop a comment below right now. Do you think Khamenei's death makes a negotiated end to this conflict more or less likely? I read every comment on stories like this one, and I want to know your read. If this kind of factual layered analysis is what you come to this channel for, hit the like button now. It helps more people find this content. And right now, every update to this story matters, because in the next section, we look at what the IRGC actually is and why it survives Khamenei's death as a functioning institution. The organization that controls Iran's missiles, its navy, and its proxy networks across the region is the real question at the center of everything unfolding right now. Here is the detail that most coverage is glossing over right now, and it changes everything about how you read Iran's response to the strikes. Trump told ABC News on Sunday that the operation was so successful it knocked out most of the candidates. His exact phrasing, delivered without hesitation. His exact quote, "It's not going to be anybody that we were thinking of because they are all dead. Second or third place is dead." That statement, delivered almost as a casual observation, describes something with no modern precedent in the history of nation-states. The entire top tier of a government succession pipeline was eliminated in a single morning, not as a theoretical risk, but as a confirmed operational outcome. According to Time magazine and the New York Times, Khamenei had privately named 3 senior clerics as his preferred successors. They were Chief Justice Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, his Chief of Staff Ali Asghar Hijazi, and Hassan Khomeini, grandson of the revolution's founder. Hijazi was killed in the strikes, Israel confirmed to the Times. That leaves the succession picture in a state that no Iranian constitutional framework was designed to handle, a leadership vacuum inside an active war. Under Article 111 of the Iranian Constitution, an interim leadership council formed on March 1st to hold authority during the transition. That council consists of President Pezeshkian, Chief Justice Mohseni Ejei, and Guardian Council jurist Alireza Arafi, a procedural structure, not a functioning government. But this council is not a government. It is a constitutional placeholder, a procedural bridge designed to function for weeks, not months, while the 88-member Assembly of Experts selects a new supreme leader. The problem is that the Assembly of Experts has never had to operate under active airstrikes, with degraded communications, a closed internet, and an IRGC command structure that just lost its top general. IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour was killed in the February 28th strikes, the second IRGC Commander-in-Chief killed in less than a year. That pattern, 2 commanders eliminated within 12 months, is not coincidence. It reflects a systematic targeting of institutional continuity at the top of Iran's military structure. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, IRGC-linked Telegram channels are pointing to Deputy Chief Ahmad Vahidi as the most likely candidate to lead the force. Vahidi was appointed by Khamenei just 2 months before his death, a detail that matters because it means the new IRGC leadership was chosen by the man who is now gone. But here is where the analysis goes deeper than any single succession question, because the IRGC is not a military force in the conventional sense. Understanding what it actually is, and what it controls, matters enormously for reading what Iran looks like in the weeks ahead. The IRGC has roughly 350,000 personnel according to Military Balance 2026, with its own Navy, Air Force, missile program, and intelligence apparatus. It operates entirely parallel to Iran's regular army, a second military inside the same country, with greater political power than the first. Beyond military power, the IRGC controls an estimated 20 to 30% of Iran's entire economy: construction, energy, import monopolies, and telecoms. That economic footprint was built over decades of sanctions-era expansion, with the IRGC filling every gap that Western pressure created in the Iranian market. It runs Khatam Al-Anbiya, the largest construction conglomerate in Iran, and controls port operations and critical supply chains. The sanctions regime that was supposed to weaken Iran inadvertently strengthened the IRGC's economic position by forcing Iran towards self-sufficiency under its management. Removing Khamenei did not remove the IRGC. It may have removed the one figure with enough authority to restrain the IRGC's most aggressive impulses. Khamenei, for all his hardline positions, held a clerical legitimacy that the IRGC cannot replicate. That restraint function, whoever exercised it, is now absent. Hassan Ahmadian, a professor at the University of Tehran, told Al Jazeera that Khamenei's doctrine of strategic patience died with him on February 28th. That doctrine, absorbing blows to avoid all-out war, was a deliberate policy choice, not a structural feature of the Iranian system. It required a leader willing to enforce it. His assessment was direct. Iran had already learned from the June 2025 war that restraint is read as weakness by adversaries, and that lesson is now fully operational. The new calculus in Tehran, Ahmadian argued, is likely to be what he called a scorched earth approach, a willingness to escalate further and faster than Khamenei would have authorized. That shift matters because the IRGC commanders now operating without a supreme leader's oversight are the same ones who built Iran's missile and drone infrastructure. They know exactly what that infrastructure can do. And as of March 2nd, there's no political authority above them with the standing to tell them to hold back. And they used it immediately. Within hours of Khamenei's confirmed death, the IRGC launched strikes on 27 U.S. military bases across the entire region. It called the operation the most extensive offensive in the history of the Islamic Republic, a statement that was not rhetorical. The scale matched the language. Now, here's the piece that most Western coverage is underweighting. The CFR stated it plainly in its post-strike analysis, and it is the most important framing of this entire situation. Taking out Khamenei is not the same as regime change. The IRGC is the regime. That is not a minor analytical footnote. It is the central fact of this entire situation. The CFR identified three possible trajectories for Iran: regime continuity, military takeover by the IRGC, or regime collapse. Critically, it assessed that none of these near-term scenarios produce meaningful political liberalization in the period immediately following the strikes. Regime continuity, essentially Khamenei's ideology without Khamenei, means the IRGC consolidates the political vacuum left by his death while maintaining the Islamic Republic's formal structures around it. Military takeover means the IRGC drops the clerical veneer and governs more directly without the Shiite religious framework as its organizing principle. Analysts at Sciences Po Grenoble describe this as a more conventional military regime, still authoritarian, but with a different ideological architecture underneath it. Regime collapse is the scenario Washington is publicly framing as the goal. Trump called on Iranians to take over your government in his February 28th statement. But collapse and liberation are not the same thing, and the gap between them, the space where a state loses function before a replacement is in place, is where the real risk lives. Iran's cities have not fallen, universities are closed, security forces are deployed in the streets, and internet access has been severely curtailed. These are the same suppression tools the regime used during the January 2026 protests, deployed now against both internal dissent and the chaos of an active military confrontation. The IRGC's ideological core, the Basij militia, embedded in every Iranian neighborhood and trained for internal suppression, remained intact as of March 2nd. That infrastructure does not disappear with a change of leadership at the top. It is distributed, local, and specifically designed to function even when central command is disrupted. What this suggests, when you look at the full picture, is that the United States and Israel have fundamentally changed the structure of the Iranian state, but they have not yet determined what replaces it. In my view, this is the central tension of everything unfolding right now. The strikes were designed to force regime change, but the mechanism for that transition is not in place. But regime change and state collapse are different outcomes, with radically different consequences for the region, for energy markets, and for American interests in the Gulf. A collapsed Iranian state with a fully intact IRGC, active missile arsenal, and proxy networks across Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen is not a solved problem. It is a different and potentially more unpredictable problem than the one it replaced, one where the weapons are the same but the restraint mechanisms are gone. Threading that needle between enough pressure to force a political transition and so much destruction the state fractures without a replacement is enormously difficult. History suggests that getting the first part right, the strike itself, is significantly easier than getting the second part right, what the country looks like 6 months later. Whether Washington has a realistic plan for the morning after, is the question that will define this conflict's outcome. And right now, that answer is not visible in any public statement from any government involved in what is happening on the ground in Iran. Because the economic dimension of all of this, what the Strait of Hormuz closure means for oil markets, for inflation, for every connected economy, ties everything together. The strategic logic of the strikes, the IRGC's response, and what happens in the succession battle all flow through the same financial pressure point. That is what comes next. As of March 2nd, 2026, at least 150 oil tankers are sitting at anchor in open Gulf waters. Fully loaded, going nowhere, waiting. They are not waiting for permission. They are waiting for insurance. And insurance, as of this week, has effectively disappeared from the Strait of Hormuz entirely. War risk premiums for Gulf transit surged by up to 50% within 48 hours of the February 28th strikes, according to shipping industry data. Major insurers began issuing cancellation notices for war risk coverage, with some policies becoming void as early as March 5th. For a standard crude tanker carrying 2 million barrels, a single percentage point insurance increase equals roughly $2.74 million per voyage. At current premium levels, transit has become economically unviable for most commercial operators, regardless of what any government says about safe passage. This is the mechanism that makes the Strait of Hormuz the most powerful economic lever on the planet. Iran does not need to sink a ship to close the strait. The insurance market does the work for it. And that is exactly what is happening right now. The IRGC issued formal warnings on VHF radio channels stating that no ship is allowed to pass through the strait. Iran has not formally declared a blockade, but ship tracking data from marine traffic shows tanker traffic through the strait has dropped by approximately 70%. 3 tankers have already been struck near the corridor, including one off the coast of Oman that was set ablaze on March 1st. Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, 2 of the world's largest shipping companies, suspended all transits through the strait and related Gulf routes. Ships that cannot transit Hormuz have one realistic alternative available to them, routing around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to every voyage. That reroute adds approximately 2 to 3 weeks to every voyage, immediately tightening global supply even without a single barrel being lost. Now let's put the actual market numbers on the table, because the price moves that have already happened in the first 48 hours of this conflict tell a precise story about what markets think comes next. Brent crude closed at approximately $72 per barrel on Friday, February 27th, just one trading day before the strikes reshaped the entire market picture. By Monday morning in Asian trading, it had surged to $80. That is an 11% move in 48 hours, with no formal closure in place, driven entirely by market perception. OPEC Plus has pledged to increase output by 206,000 barrels per day in response to the disruption, according to reporting on the 2026 Hormuz crisis. That number is not a typo. The strait carries 20 million barrels per day. The OPEC Plus response covers roughly 1% of what is at risk in a full closure scenario. Goldman Sachs published its scenario analysis on March 2nd, with analyst Don Striven describing tanker traffic as significantly disrupted. Striven identified Hormuz flows as the most important variable to watch in energy markets, a statement published by the largest investment bank in the United States. Goldman's base model for a full 1-month closure with no offsets estimates a Brent price increase of approximately $15 per barrel from current levels. That puts Brent in the high 80s to low 90s under their fair value framework. And that is the conservative scenario, not the tail risk. Goldman noted that in periods of elevated geopolitical uncertainty, oil prices regularly trade well above fair value estimates as risk premiums expand beyond model inputs. Their own historical analysis confirms that perception drives prices higher than models predict when markets assign meaningful probability to escalation scenarios. Oxford Economics estimated that even a 1-week complete halt of straight transit would be enough to push Brent crude to $140 per barrel. Ali Larijani, director of the Iran project at the International Crisis Group, described a full closure as generating prices that would gap violently upward on fear alone, before any actual supply disappears. Here is the number that ties all of these scenarios together. The IEA estimates that only approximately 4.2 million barrels per day could be rerouted through existing pipeline infrastructure if the strait closes fully. The strait currently moves 20 million barrels per day. Pipeline alternatives can reroute approximately 4.2 million barrels per day at best. That leaves roughly 16 million barrels per day with no alternative route. Not through pipelines, not reserves, not through any existing infrastructure at realistic speed. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline has a capacity of 5 million barrels per day, but currently runs at roughly half that volume. The UAE's Fujairah pipeline adds another 1.5 million. Combined realistic bypass capacity sits around 4 to 5 million barrels per day, covering about 20 to 25% of normal straight volume. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve holds approximately 400 million barrels as of early 2026. At global consumption rates, that covers roughly 4 days of total world demand. It is not a solution to a sustained Hormuz closure. It is a political bridge, and a very short one at the volumes currently at risk. Now here is the piece that reframes who actually holds leverage in this economic confrontation. And it is hiding in plain sight in the shipping destination data. According to EIA data, 84% of all crude oil transiting Hormuz flows to Asian markets, primarily China, India, Japan, and South Korea. The United States sources roughly 7% of its crude imports through Hormuz, meaningfully insulated by its domestic shale production base from the immediate shock. China alone imports approximately 50% of its total crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz, according to analysis published this week. Japan and South Korea are similarly exposed, with no alternative supply sources at equivalent scale or cost available on any short timeline. In my view, this asymmetry is one of the most important and underreported dimensions of this entire conflict. The country most economically damaged by a sustained Hormuz closure is not the United States. It is China. And China's response so far has been to condemn the U.S.-Israeli strikes through official channels, while simultaneously evacuating more than 300 nationals from Iran and watching its energy security evaporate in real time. Beijing's Foreign Minister Wang Yi described the killing of Khamenei as unacceptable and condemned what he called the blatant killing of a sovereign leader. But condemnation does not reopen an insurance market. Chinese-flagged vessels are among the few still transiting the strait, taking on risk that no Western operator currently will. The geopolitical dimension of China's exposure is significant. A conflict that Washington can partially absorb through domestic production becomes an acute crisis for Beijing within days. If the disruption extends into weeks, China faces supply gaps that cannot be filled quickly by any alternative route or supplier at the required volume. That creates a diplomatic pressure dynamic that operates entirely separately from the military confrontation. Economic pain as a lever toward de-escalation. Beijing has strong incentives to push for de-escalation, not out of principle, but out of direct economic self-interest. And that pressure grows with every day the strait remains effectively closed. Kapler identified this dynamic explicitly in their March 1st analysis. If the conflict extends beyond a few weeks, both India and China face strong incentives to deepen reliance on Russian crude. Moscow's competitive position in global oil markets is improving with every day the Gulf remains in active conflict. A structural shift that may not reverse even after fighting stops. That is the longer-term structural shift hiding underneath the immediate price moves. A sustained disruption does not just spike oil prices. It accelerates the reshaping of global energy trade flows in ways that may not fully reverse even after the conflict ends, redirecting supply chains that took decades to build. What this suggests, when you look at the full economic picture, is that the February 28th strikes triggered two crises simultaneously, a political succession crisis inside Iran and a global energy shock. The magnitude of the energy shock depends entirely on how long the IRGC can maintain effective disruption of the world's most critical waterway. What military assets the IRGC retains after the strikes, what Iran's next negotiating position looks like, and whether any path to de-escalation actually exists, those are the questions that determine whether this becomes a contained shock or something with a much longer and more painful trajectory. That is what comes next. Here's the detail that makes this entire story more complicated than any single narrative of victory or defeat can currently capture. On February 27th, one day before the strikes, Oman's foreign minister Badr al-Busaidi said a diplomatic breakthrough had been reached. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium and to accept full IAEA verification. Al-Busaidi said peace was within reach. 24 hours later, the strikes came anyway. The UN Secretary-General Guterres addressed the Security Council the next day. His assessment before the Council was unambiguous. I deeply regret that this opportunity of diplomacy has been squandered. Those words were directed at every party in the room. That sequence, a diplomatic agreement on Saturday, bombs on Sunday, is the detail that reframes everything about how this conflict started and what resolving it will require. Because the question now is not what Iran was willing to agree to before February 28th. The question is what the system that remains after Khamenei's death is willing or able to agree to now. And as of March 2nd, the signals coming out of Tehran are sending two completely contradictory messages simultaneously through two different channels at the same time. Message 1 came from Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, speaking to his Omani counterpart on March 1st. According to the Oman news agency, Araghchi said Iran's position calls for peace. He said Tehran remains open to any serious effort contributing to de-escalation and the restoration of stability, language that reads as a diplomatic opening. Message 2 came from Ali Larijani, Iran's security chief, the most powerful surviving figure in the Iranian system, who posted on X the same day, "We will not negotiate with the United States." That is not a contradiction in the usual diplomatic sense. That is two different power centers inside a decapitated state, sending two different signals to two different audiences simultaneously. In my view, this is the most consequential dynamic to watch in the days ahead. The Iranian system has lost its single arbiter, the one figure who could resolve internal contradictions. Khamenei was the figure who resolved internal contradictions with a final word. What you are seeing now, two contradictory signals, two different channels, is what that system looks like without him. The Soufan Center published its analysis on March 1st and described this dynamic with a precision that is worth understanding clearly before drawing any conclusions about what Iran will do next. It assessed that any diplomatic signals from Tehran right now are likely to be tactical positioning to bridge the period between supreme leaders, not a genuine strategic shift in Iran's position. Iran may be willing to slow the escalation temporarily, not because its strategic position has changed, but because it needs time. Time to consolidate a new leadership structure, resolve the internal power struggle, and approach any negotiation from a position that carries legitimate authority inside the system. Trump told The Atlantic on March 1st that Iran's new leadership had expressed interest in negotiations and that he had agreed to talk. His exact words to The Atlantic: "They want to talk, and I have agreed to talk. They should have done it sooner. They waited too long." The tone was not conciliatory. It was transactional. But there is no clearly defined new leadership in Tehran right now, and that is precisely the problem. The interim council is a constitutional placeholder, not a negotiating partner with a mandate. Pezeshkian, Mohseni Ejei, and Arafi were never designed to negotiate the end of an active war. That is not what Article 111 of the Iranian Constitution created them to do. And Larijani, who holds the most practical operational authority over Iran's security apparatus right now, said it publicly on X, for the record. "We will not negotiate with the United States." Not a private communication, not a back channel, a public statement made while strikes were still ongoing. Now step back and look at where all the external players are positioned as of March 2nd, because the international response to these strikes is not a single voice, and it matters for what comes next. The UN Secretary General called for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Macron demanded an Emergency Security Council meeting. The EU called for maximum restraint. Spain explicitly rejected the strikes as illegal unilateral military action, a direct rebuke of a NATO ally from within the alliance itself. China's Wang Yi demanded an immediate ceasefire and described the killing of a sovereign leader as unacceptable. Russia's Putin called it a cynical murder. Both called for a return to dialogue. Neither has the diplomatic leverage to compel it, but both have the economic exposure and the Security Council veto to complicate any exit strategy. On the other side of that divide, Australia, Canada, and the UK expressed support for preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, backing Washington explicitly on the core stated rationale. Germany's Merz acknowledged what he called a dilemma, but said decades of relying on international law and sanctions had proven clearly ineffective against the Iranian regime. And here is the detail that changes the regional picture most directly. Hezbollah joined the war on March 2nd, the same day this video is being published. Strikes from Lebanon began targeting Israel. The conflict that started as a U.S.-Israeli operation against Iran is now drawing in a second Iranian proxy on a second front. Israel's defense minister responded by stating publicly that Hezbollah's Secretary General Naim Qassem is marked for elimination, signaling that the Lebanese front is now an active target. The Houthis in Yemen have threatened to escalate their Red Sea campaign. The conflict is no longer contained to Iran, Israel, and U.S. bases. It is expanding outward on multiple axes. What this suggests is that the situation on March 2nd has three distinct tracks running simultaneously, each capable of driving the outcome independently of the others. The first track is military. Strikes continue on both sides. Iran is still launching missiles and drones, and the IRGC has not exhausted its retaliatory arsenal. The U.S. has not achieved its stated goal of regime change, and American service members have already been killed in the Iranian retaliatory strikes on Gulf bases. The second track is diplomatic. Oman remains active as a mediator. Iran's foreign minister is still communicating with Gulf counterparts. Trump says he is willing to talk. But Larijani's public statement creates a constraint that any Iranian negotiator would have to navigate carefully around, not through. The third track is economic. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively disrupted, and every day of disruption adds pressure across multiple economies simultaneously. That pressure falls on Asian importers, on Gulf states whose infrastructure is being struck, and on the inflation arithmetic that shapes domestic politics in Washington and Brussels. In my view, the third track will ultimately determine the timeline of the first two. Economic pressure from a sustained Hormuz disruption is not selective. It lands on Beijing, Tokyo, Seoul, Mumbai, Berlin, and Houston at the same time, and that convergence of shared pain is the most powerful driver of negotiation that exists. Shared economic pain creates a convergence of interests that no military objective or diplomatic statement can replicate on its own. When enough players are losing enough money fast enough, the pressure for a negotiated off-ramp becomes structural rather than ideological, and structural pressure is harder to ignore. The question is whether that pressure builds fast enough to create a diplomatic opening before the military track produces an outcome that closes the space for negotiation entirely. And the answer to that question, a contained shock with a negotiated exit, or something with a longer and more destructive trajectory, is not yet determined. It is being decided right now, simultaneously, in Tehran, in Washington, in Beijing, and in Moscow. On March 2nd, no single actor controls the outcome. What we know with certainty on March 2nd is this. The man who said we will not negotiate with America, who built his entire foreign policy around that refusal, is dead. The system he built is still standing, damaged, decapitated, but operational. And the people now speaking for that system are saying two different things through two different channels at once. That is not a resolution. That is the beginning of the next phase. And the next phase is the one that will define the Middle East, global energy markets, and the U.S. strategic position in the region for years to come. If this gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening and why, drop a comment below. What do you think comes next? A ceasefire, an escalation, or a prolonged war of attrition that nobody wins cleanly? And if you've made it this far, you already know this channel goes deeper than the headlines. Subscribe, because this story is moving fast, and the next development could come before the end of this week.